Air travel is supposed to be the great equalizer. When you buy a ticket, whether it's economy or first class, you've paid for your seat, your comfort, your right to travel. But sometimes people forget that behind the luxury of a cabin, behind the uniforms of the crew, behind the prestige of an airline, there are deeper truths about humility, respect, and equality. This is the story of a man who walked onto one of his own airplanes as just another passenger. A man with a first class ticket, a simple smile, and no intention of revealing who he really was. But what unfolded on that flight would change the way his staff saw their jobs and would serve as a lesson about privilege that no one on board would ever forget. His name was Richard. At 60 years old, Richard was the founder and majority owner of a well-known airline. He had built it from scratch back when he was a young man with a dream and nothing more than a few borrowed dollars. Over decades of hard work, sacrifices, sleepless nights, and relentless passion, his airline had become one of the most respected in the region. But Richard was not the kind of man who lived only in boardrooms. He had a habit of flying anonymously, buying his own ticket, and experiencing firsthand what passengers experience. If you don't see the world through your customer's eyes, he used to say, you don't really run an airline, you run a machine. And so, on that cloudy morning, Richard arrived at the airport alone. No chauffeur, no bodyguards, no corporate team escorting him to a VIP lounge. Just a man in a navy suit, carrying a small leather bag. He had paid for a first-class ticket, but he looked like any other business traveler. Calm, polite, ordinary. The boarding process was smooth. Richard greeted the flight attendants with a smile, handed them his boarding pass, and walked down the jet bridge. Inside the first-class cabin, the leather seats gleamed, and passengers were settling in. Richard placed his bag in the overhead bin, adjusted his seat, and prepared to enjoy the quiet comfort of the cabin. But comfort that day was not in the cards. Only minutes later, another man entered the cabin. His name was Mr. Andrews. He was a frequent flyer, well dressed in an expensive suit, gold watch gleaming on his wrist, his confidence filling the room before he even spoke. Everyone in the cabin seemed to know the type, a man who believed money not only bought a seat but bought superiority. Mr. Andrews stopped by Richard's seat. He frowned, looked at his own boarding pass, and back at Richard. "That's my seat," he said curtly. Richard looked up calmly. "I don't think so. This is seat 2A, isn't it?" He held up his boarding pass. It was indeed 2A. Andrews shook his head. "Yes, but I always sit here. I've been flying with this airline for years. The staff knows me. You'll have to move." Richard smiled faintly, thinking it was a misunderstanding. "I'm afraid this is my assigned seat. Perhaps there's some confusion. The crew will help sort it out." Andrews wasn't pleased. He immediately signaled a flight attendant. She arrived quickly, eager to please what appeared to be a valuable frequent flyer. "Yes, Mr. Andrews. Is there a problem?" "This man is in my seat," Andrews declared, pointing at Richard as though he were an intruder. "Please move him." The attendant glanced nervously between the two men. She checked Richard's boarding pass. "Sir, you're in 2A, she said, her voice soft. Then she turned back to Andrews. "Mr. Andrews, your ticket says 3C. "I don't care what it says," Andrews snapped. "You know I always sit here. Make him move. Put him somewhere else. Tourist class if you have to." Richard felt a strange mix of amusement and disappointment. He remained calm. "I paid for this seat," he said firmly, "and I intend to stay." The attendant was visibly torn. Mr. Andrews was known by the crew. He was a frequent flyer, someone who demanded special treatment. And Richard? To them, he was just another passenger, unremarkable. The situation escalated. Another attendant joined in, then the purser, and finally the captain himself came out of the cockpit. "Gentlemen, what seems to be the problem?" Before Richard could answer, Andrews raised his voice. "This man is in my seat. I've flown with your airline more times than I can count. I deserve respect. Move him to economy if you have to. This is ridiculous." The captain looked at Richard, then at the boarding passes. He hesitated. "Sir," he said to Richard, "perhaps it would be best if you cooperated. We can find you another seat in economy. It will only be for this flight." There was a murmur among the first-class passengers. A few whispered, some smirked, others looked away. It was an uncomfortable scene. But Richard did not move. He straightened his back, his voice steady, but strong. "I'm not going anywhere. I paid for this seat, and I will not be pushed aside because another man feels entitled to take what is mine." The cabin grew tense. The attendants, now flustered, tried to convince him. Andrews sneered, certain he would win. And then Richard sighed, reached into his jacket, and pulled out his ID card. He held it up for the captain and the crew to see. The card bore his name, his full name, Richard H. Lowell, founder and majority owner of the very airline they were flying on. The crew froze, their faces drained of color. The captain's mouth opened, but no words came out. The attendants glanced at each other, suddenly realizing the gravity of their mistake. "And Mr. Andrews?" His arrogance crumbled instantly, replaced by shock, then embarrassment, then fear. Richard let the silence linger for a moment. Then he spoke. "I came here today to travel as a passenger. Nothing more. I wanted to see how my airline treats people. And now I have seen." He turned to the crew. "You were willing to strip a paying passenger of his rights, simply because another man demanded it. You forgot that every seat sold is a promise of respect, of dignity, of fairness. That promise was broken today." And then he turned to Andrews. "And you thought your wealth, your history of flying, gave you the right to push another person aside. You believed privilege was more powerful than principle. But today, you've learned otherwise." The cabin was silent. The crew stood stiff, ashamed. The captain lowered his head. Andrews could not meet Richard's gaze. Richard continued. "From this day forward, you, Mr. Andrews, are banned from flying on my airline. You will no longer use this company to satisfy your arrogance. As for the crew, disciplinary actions will be taken. Consider this your reminder that your job is not to serve privilege, it is to serve fairness." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the cabin. Then he added, with a voice that carried to every ear in the room, "Never forget this. No matter who we are, no matter what we own, no matter how much money we have, in the air, we are all just passengers, equal, nothing more, nothing less." The lesson struck deep. The flight continued, quiet and reflective. The attendants moved carefully, aware of the weight of their mistake. And for the rest of the journey, Richard sat in his rightful seat, not as an owner or a businessman, but as what he always wanted to be, just another traveler. When the plane landed, the story spread. Passengers told it to friends, who told it to others. Soon, it became a legend within the airline, a story repeated during staff training, a reminder of humility and justice. And to this day, whenever a flight attendant hands a passenger a drink, or a captain greets a traveler at the door, somewhere in the back of their minds they remember Richard Lowell's words, "Never forget, we are all equal."